Welcome to the third part of this four-part series. And you may be wondering, why did I call this broadband spirituality, other than maybe that sounds kind of catchy, which I think it does. But uh, so uh, if you've been around long enough to remember the early days of modems that were 300K was considered a fast modem. And when you downloaded a picture, it would just be line by line by line. It would take several minutes to even see a picture. Then it would go back again and make it a little bit clearer and a little bit clearer. And you certainly didn't have the capacity for anything like this, a live video transmission, because the speeds have gotten a lot more. Well, in some ways, most people function like a three modem in their consciousness, although they don't think of it as being slow, because it's the normal state of being for the majority of people. And what does that mean? It means that their world consists of what is perceived through the physical senses and the thoughts about the senses and the emotions about the senses and so on. And the expectations about what's going to happen next. Oh, and by the way, it'd be good. Yeah, everybody's muted themselves. So, and that's the perception that takes place. And if there's anything outside of that, it probably isn't even going to be perceived. Or if it is perceived, it will be just discounted as, well, that's not very significant, because the main channel is the way that I think that things are going to be. And that's just talking about the normal channels of perception, which most people are limited to. And last time I made mention of what the mystics call the subtle senses, the subtle sensory capacities that mystics across traditions talk about. And they may have different names, but common ones would be like the inner seeing, the inner tasting, the inner hearing, inner touch, and so on, that are very common with experiences that mystics have. And they're experiences that don't take place in the ordinary physical reality. They can certainly take place with eyes closed, and it seems to be an experience of an inner realm, but inner not meaning just inside your body, but someplace that is different than the usual physical realm. And that realm can seem much vaster than the world that we see with our eyes open. So some people might hear this and think, well, they just have vivid imaginations. Well, maybe so. Imagination is a valuable quality, but there's a difference between imagination that is just governed by fantasy, by just kind of random thoughts, and what Ibn Arabi and other mystics call creative imagination, which is an imagination that is directed in a certain way, with certain capacities that have been developed. So there are practices that have been developed, tools for working with consciousness, tools for developing subtle senses that have been around in different spiritual traditions for, in some cases, thousands of years, probably starting back with the ancient yogis that didn't have scientific equipment to explore their external world. They didn't have telescopes, they didn't have microscopes, but they had consciousness, and they learned how to modulate their consciousness to discover, first of all, subtle anatomy in the body, subtle energy channels that are very similar to now what is described in energy traditions such as acupuncture, subtle energy pathways that are in the body, subtle plexes, which are given different names in different traditions. In yoga, they're called chakras, which many of you have probably heard of, the basic 7 chakras, starting with the base of the spine, going all the way up to the top of the head, the crown chakra. In Sufism, there's more of them identified. They're called lata'if, and they're a little bit different, but they're just different names for kind of clusters of these subtle nerves and capacities that are developed when someone is able to, first of all, become aware of the existence of these subtle nerve centers, but then to be able to open them and to develop the capacity to make sense of and to experience what is perceived and processed through these subtle channels. And they're very different experiences that are described depending on what subtle center is the, you could think it's like a gateway to a certain realm of reality or consciousness or vibration or experience. Now let me segue back to someone that I talked about last time, a scientist named William Tiller, who's done a lot of research with subtle energy. And as I previously mentioned, he has shown that whenever something brings about a linkage between subtle energy and what he calls ordinary reality, then the basic laws of physics operate differently than normally. There's now things possible, there's more degrees of freedom that can take place in this. And I mentioned his famous experiment of people putting an intention into a bit of circuitry to either raise the pH of water or lower it by 1 point. And sure enough, when they would ship this little bit of inert circuitry off to a lab and it was all done in an automated manner, that's what would happen. If the intention was for the pH to go up 1, it would go up 1, and down 1, it would go down 1. And as I mentioned last time, not only that, but the entropy, the degree of disorder, which normally would continually increase in the laboratory where this circuitry was put, actually decreased. So there was an increased order rather than an increase in disorder, which isn't supposed to happen, but does happen. And this has been replicated with other kinds of experiments whenever there's this linkage. So why do I recount this story again? Well, the reason I do is because there are many, many ways to bring about this connection between subtle energy and ordinary manifestation. And one of them is through meditation. And there are many, many forms of meditation. There are also many practices that help awaken the subtle senses. And whenever any of these work to even a little bit of a degree, it brings about this connection with subtle energy and ordinary reality. And there's a transformation even in the environment that takes place by virtue of doing this. So there's literally a change brought about in the world around us when we are able to activate this capacity to awaken one or more of the subtle senses and to be able to experience a form of subtle energy. Well, we couldn't experience a form of subtle energy unless we had been able to make this connection between the subtle realm and the usual realm in which we operate from. So tonight we're going to be doing a sampler of some different practices that you can take and spend more time with if they appeal to you and work with them. And while these practices are very simple, they're very powerful and effective, and they're ways of beginning to become aware of subtle energies that are always present in our being, because our being is way more than our physical body. It's way more than what's measured with ordinary scientific equipment in terms of electrical response of the skin, brain waves, cardiac function, and so on. There are now instruments that can measure different forms of subtle energy, but we don't need these instruments to practice these techniques. So one, because we're made out of matter, we have a magnetic field that surrounds our body. And this magnetic field varies in intensity throughout the day, depending on how balanced we are, depending on what our mood is, what our emotional state is. If we're in expansive kind of mood, the magnetic field is broader, it's vaster. If we're really angry or just kind of energy pulled in, the magnetic energy field literally shrinks for the time being. So we're going to start with a simple practice. So you can try this with me. And what I'd like you to do is to visualize that there is a semicircle of compasses at a distance of 3 feet, starting at the ground and going up your left side above your head and going down the right side back to the ground. And there's just all these compasses positioned along the way. So that's probably not too difficult to do. And you can do this practice with your eyes open or closed. It doesn't really matter. And now what you're going to imagine as you exhale, you are expanding your magnetic energy field. And you don't have to figure out, well, hell, let's see exactly what's the physics phenomena. It doesn't, you don't need to worry about that. You're just having the intention of expanding your magnetic energy field as you exhale. And as you exhale, the effect of this magnetic energy field on the compasses, imagine that instead of them all pointing north, they're all going to be deflected to point more towards the east, maybe northeast or even east as you exhale. And as you inhale, imagine you're just drawing your magnetic energy field back in. And now what happens with the compasses is the needle is going to go the opposite way. It's going to move towards the northwest or even to the west. So let's try this for just a moment. I'll be quiet for a moment. And so as you exhale, just imagine you're expanding your magnetic field. The compass needles are all being deflected towards the east. And as you inhale, you pull the magnetic field back in and they're deflected towards the west. So we'll just do this for a minute. And now if you're able to do this, continue the practice, but put the compasses 6 feet away instead of 3 feet and do the same thing. And then put them even further away if you're able to do this, 10 feet or 12 feet. And notice now, if you feel a shift in your energy, perhaps you feel kind of a buzzing or pulsing or tingling in your hands or your feet. As you've activated your capacity to actually modulate the intensity of the magnetic field around your body just by virtue of your breath and your thoughts and your intention. And you might be wondering, well, how can just my thoughts change what happens to my state of being? And how can it change my breath? Uh, so let's do another little sampler. So for this one, you might find it easier to close your eyes. And I'm going to give you some different things to focus on briefly and notice how your breathing changes and how your whole feeling of your energy changes. So imagine the vast blue sky. And now imagine a very large mountain, majestic mountain. Imagine that you are that mountain. Now imagine that you are a river with rapids flowing over rocks. Imagine the color spring green. Now imagine the color fire engine red. And now just breathe in the word peace on each inhalation. Just think peace. And now breathe in the word joy. And now the word love on the in-breath. And then relax and just reflect for a bit on how your breathing changed depending on the object that you were holding with each breath. How your energy perhaps seemed very different when you were thinking of red versus green, when you're thinking of a mountain versus a river with rapids, when you were thinking of peace versus thinking of joy. So without trying to, just holding different things as a focus on the breath had a significant impact on your energy. Which goes into the reason why in different traditions, sacred sounds are used, I think, across every mystical tradition that I'm aware of. And as I mentioned last time, there are at least 3 languages that are said to be sacred languages, Arabic, Sanskrit, and Hebrew, because the sounds that make up the words are not arbitrary. They're supposed to actually carry the vibration of what they mean. And I mentioned last time, in times gone by, teachers in these different traditions, oftentimes when they would give a student a sacred word, they wouldn't tell them what it meant, but the student would discover what it meant by working with it. It would reveal its meaning. So these words have effects for 2 reasons. One, there's the collective effect of how these sacred words have been utilized, sometimes for thousands of years. So there's a kind of field that's been built up. Some of you may be familiar with Rupert Sheldrake talks about the morphogenic field, and he uses an example of the 100th monkey, about the supposedly on this one island that was 20 miles away from another island, and no possibility of the monkeys on one island seeing the ones on the other. And both monkeys ate sweet potatoes, and one of the monkeys on one of the islands started washing the sweet potatoes before eating it. Before, they would just eat it as it would come out of the ground. And very shortly after that, the monkeys on the other island all started doing this, and there wasn't any way of communicating with this. And so he theorizes there's something that's contributed to the energy field of a particular group of animals, or it doesn't even have to be animals. He uses an example that many times in chemistry, there's some very difficult to synthesize crystalline substance, but once someone figures out how to do it, even though the instructions have been there for everyone to use, then it becomes easier for other people to do it around the world. And the same phenomena has been measured with the New York Times crossword puzzle. It's easier to solve the Sunday crossword puzzle if you wait a day when many, many people have already solved it than if you do it right when it comes out. So I bring this up as a way of understanding one of the reasons why working with these sacred words is so powerful, because they have been worked with for such a long period of time. They've built up a connection with subtle energy that's very potent. And the other way that they work is just from the vibration of the words themselves, activate some of these different subtle energy centers in our body just by doing them. And so we're going to work with a what's in Sufism is considered a pretty basic practice, but it's a wonderful practice. And the word is fazl, F-A-Z-L, which literally means blessing. And doing this practice, it's said over and over again, and you breathe when you need to, and the F almost becomes like a V. It almost becomes like Basel, Basel. But as we do this practice, and I'll do it, but you can do it where you are, and do it at your own rate, and perhaps you'll begin to feel the effect of this. So I'll just do it out loud for a while, and you can join with me even while you remain muted where you are. And you don't have to worry about thinking about, well, let's see, this means blessing, and somehow this is vibrating. No, you just go ahead and do it, and allow yourself to experience the effect of it. And when you make the ah sound, try to make it in the heart area, so it's like your throat is open. It's like ah, and you can feel. So try this. Put your hand on your chest and say ah. Your own pitch doesn't have to be the same as mine, and you should feel a vibration where your hand is, as opposed to ah, which would be your throat not being open. So it's ah down there. So it's like this. Join with me. Don't worry, you're muted. We can't hear you, so you have to feel embarrassed, but try it. Ball, 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 ball. So this is one you can work on your own. You can do it all by yourself, but it's a wonderful practice. It's the you can think of it as like when you strike a gong. If you've ever been around a large gong, there's the initial sound, but then it reverberates. It's like bong, and you can hear it for a long time. So this builds up a vibration like this, and it's a wonderful way just to give yourself a subtle energy tune-up by doing this practice. So I would encourage you to try it and see what happens with it. So let's pause for a little bit here, and I'd like to hear from you about any of the things we've tried so far. Did you notice any change doing them, and which ones seem to resonate more strongly with you perhaps than another one did? So unmute yourself if you want to say something. Yes, Doug. You're still on. There we go.
Yeah. What it brings up for me is several different things, and not just the practices themselves, but maybe the concepts behind them. Because what I wonder about, when I was growing up there in your neck of the woods, South Texas, and as a very young child, I went and participated in many shamanic curandero healings, Mexican folk healer healings, and saw some unexplainable, miraculous things happen as a kid. And that whetted my appetite in terms of the mystery and how do these things happen. So then I began to wonder that, is there something about focusing on ritual, on a word or in an image that is culturally in the collective conscious of that culture and of the caregivers? Because I get a stronger resonance with my grandmother, who was my primary caregiver, saying, "Ay, mi amor, mi amor, mi amor," you know, my love, my love, my love, than I do with the sacred words that are Sanskrit. So I begin to wonder about, on a body level, that embodiment of that nurturing and that connection with other humans, as well as the collective consciousness in the culture in which I grew up in, and the power that that has. And then not only that, but my beliefs that get attached to the stories with that. You know, my grandmother loves me because look at how she soothes me and holds me and nurtures me and does those kinds of things. And I see it all around me and so forth. So I'm just wondering if it's a both and, that there is an external influence as well as a cultural caregiver embodiment that empowers an individual. I just put that out there for thought.
Yeah, no, wonderful question, and absolutely. And this is one reason why at least many people initially on their spiritual journey, and maybe for the whole course of the journey, are more drawn, if they're going to get into mysticism, to explore the practices of the tradition that they grew up in or that they're familiar with. So if they're Christian, let's say doing Gregorian chants or doing sitting with an icon or something like that, whereas a Buddhist would be much more able to relate to Buddhist chants and the sounds, you know, those long horns and the sacred diagrams that they make sometimes in sand and then erase them, and in Judaism the symbols of the Sephiroth, the tree of life, that are come in the Kabbalah and the Zohar. So it's natural that if there's already a cultural tie-in to doing a sacred practice, it's going to probably be much easier to access and be much more potent. And if if someone has let's say an more adventurous soul, and they want to kind of explore sacred practices of the different traditions, and the Sufi group that I belong to, I mean, that's always been its history to embrace the sacred teachings of all the major religions of the world, all the mystical traditions. So I can feel at home trying out any of these different practices, even though they may be initially unfamiliar to me, but just seeing them all as portals, a way of accessing a certain modality of experience of sacredness. And it's not generic sacredness. That I think this is kind of a fault of our language when we hear terms like this, or even presence, divine presence, if we have a belief in a divine being, it's just all the same. Well, absolutely not. That'd be like saying every perfume is the same because they're made from flowers. Well, they're so different. Or that every kind of wine is the same because they're made from grapes. There's so many characteristics and nuances. Well, by awakening and developing the subtle senses, then we can develop the facility to be able to zero in on particular aspects of the bounty of all the different ways there are to experience the deeper nature of reality, which is infinite. I mean, we couldn't possibly take it all in, but we can go along certain, you could call it pathways, although they're not linear pathways. So a very good question. And the other part of it is our way of experiencing in our thinking. Oftentimes we think, well, there is something out there, and I'll just use, call it divine presence, that, you know, if I can do certain practices or raise myself to a high enough level, then I can access the place where this divine presence is, as opposed to realizing we couldn't experience this, whatever we want to call it, and I'll just call it divine presence here, unless we were opened up to that capacity in our own being, where that is what manifests by the relationship with what we're experiencing. It's not pre-existing and sitting out there waiting for someone to get to it. It actually is what emerges in the condition in which we are relating to something through that particular modality. And the same is true, I believe, of any kind of mystical practice, divine names, divine qualities. We're actually opening up to a way of experiencing the deeper nature of reality, and the conduit, I sometimes call it the currency, the means or modality that we're using could be love, could be compassion, could be wisdom, could be truth, could be beauty or whatever. But that quality isn't, this is my own belief. You know, I was taught for so many years there are these unchanging archetypes of this goes all the way back to Plato, of these archetypal qualities, and they don't change. Well, I don't believe that that's true. I believe that they do change, and they become even more themselves by virtue of the way that we relate to them and experience them. And that's true of every being that ever does that. It kind of adds to the pot of what now can be experienced through whatever that quality happens to be. So thank you for that question. I hope I answered it. Yes, Lee.
So I have spent a lot of time, you know, practicing the subtle.
A little bit louder, please.
I have spent a lot of time practicing subtle energies and those kind of things. And so when we did that exercise of the compasses, you know, and we expand our energy field, you know, I can physically feel the compasses when I get close to them. It's like a shiver, you know, in my energy field. And as I move them away, it's not as strong. It's like somebody, it's like, you know, I'm touching those compasses. And, you know, my question is, you know, when we develop these kind of subtle energies or sacred centers, it's the interpretation of it that I find we have to be careful about, because I can feel vibrations in a room. You know, if somebody is speaking something that is, let's say, in a vibration that is of truth, I'll phrase it like that. And when I feel a disruption, you know, it's like I feel it in my field. But to interpret those kind of things is very, very, I find it, I have to be cautious about it. And so do you have anything to say about that kind of thing?
Well, anyone that has, and some people by nature are much more sensitive to subtle energy vibrations, which can be a good thing, but it can also be a challenging thing, because if you're open to that and you're around vibrations that are not very harmonious or negative or very intense, you can feel like you've been slammed in the gut. And so there are some simple practices that can help with that. And one that my teacher, Pierre Vilayet, taught was at the start of each day just to take your hand and to trace like a disc around your solar plexus, and imagine you're putting a disc of blue light around your solar plexus. And you don't have to keep doing this all day. And this solar plexus is an area in which we're very sensitive to taking in vibrational input from the environment. This acts as kind of a filter to filter out things that you don't want. And in particular, if you're around a circumstance or a person that has a bunch of intense, perhaps negative, angry energy or whatever, you can put one or both hands over your solar plexus. You could do this standing or sitting, and it'll just let it go around you instead of absorbing it. Because I've known many very sensitive people over the years that have a very difficult time in their lives because they pick up on things so much. And they're just really buffeted, whereas some people, you know, are not affected at all, but they also don't have much awareness of anything more than what just comes through the physical senses. So is that helpful with what you're asking, or did I get to what you're asking?
That isn't exactly the aspect, you know, because it doesn't really affect me in that way. It doesn't disturb me. It's that the caution about how do we interpret what we're experiencing, in the sense of is it a valid, or you know, you've had people that come up and say, oh, I know you did this because I feel this, you know.
Okay. So think of a radio receiver, and imagine that the radio receiver, the frequency just kind of wanders around, and you find that your radio is just picking up all sorts of stuff. Well, you probably would realize there's something wrong with my radio. I need to get another one or get it fixed so I can just tune into what I want to tune into. Many times the thoughts that we have and the emotions that we have, we might assume that they're ours, but actually we may be picking up on something that's coming from externally, but our minds like to make sense of things, and so we'll come up with a rationale for why we're having a feeling that we're having and assigning some meaning to it. Like if you get a real uncomfortable feeling around another person, you might go, well, they don't like me, you know. Well, too bad for them, you know, that there must be something wrong with them because I'm such a good person. And maybe you're just picking up on they're really having a hard time because there's something wrong with their health, or they had some problem in their family or with their work. But the way you're interpreting that sensation may be totally inaccurate. So it's always good to, the Sufis talk about being able to see things from multiple points of view, to ask yourself, well, what else might be going on other than my assumption about what's happening in this circumstance? And there's a Sufi story about two people arguing, and they consult this wise Sufi teacher, and the first one tells a story and the teacher says, you're right. Excuse me. The second one tells his story, which is totally opposite, and he says, you're right. And the third one comes along and says, you've agreed with both of them, and they're saying the opposite things, and he says, you are also right. So it's all about the perspective. And awakening to a large part, you could say, is learning how to modulate our perspective so we're not caught in a, first of all, in a fixed perspective where most people are, or in a limited perspective that can only see one side of things. And this is how people get so polarized in their belief systems, because we're right and you're wrong, instead of seeing the truth that may be present in somebody that you very much disagree with. So it's very helpful just to be open to understanding that how you're interpreting something, even if it feels like, well, this must be right, isn't necessarily what it is. That's just your perception. And so there are other practices we certainly don't have time to get into in this series of working on getting to the consciousness of another person and really perceiving, well, what's the world like from this person? How do they perceive me in this circumstance? And then you may, well, when I was doing my psychology practice, not quite the same thing, but working with couples, this is an old exercise I certainly didn't invent. A lot of times I'd have them physically switch places on the couch and says, all right, you're the wife, and to the wife, you're the husband, and now keep your argument going, but you be the other person. And it'd be amazing how they would see things so differently when they adopted the other person's perspective. You realize, oh, I could see how they could see things this way. So it's just getting to a place of freedom where you're not bound by the initial assumption of how you think that things are, realizing there's probably always another way that the same situation can be perceived, and one of them is not necessarily right and the other one's not necessarily wrong. So is that helpful?
Yeah. So as we open to these subtle senses, we still remain open.
Yeah, and we don't want to presume this can happen. Like if someone, I mean, some people can just naturally see auras, and that doesn't mean they're more spiritually evolved, but they may go around thinking, well, I must be better than other people. I'm going to start telling people what's wrong with them, or you're this or that, and that's just so beyond presumptuous to be doing something like that. So, yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah. Oh, I thought, okay. Well, let's do a little bit more in the way of practices. So here's another wonderful practice, and this one's working with life energy instead of magnetism, or sometimes called the energy of pure spirit. Uh, and so for this practice, close your eyes and imagine that you're surrounded by a field of uh, roses, and the roses are closed. They're closed. And now as you exhale, imagine there is a lotus in your heart, and as you exhale, the lotus opens, but you're actually emanating life energy or energy of pure spirit in all directions to this field of roses, and the roses blossom. They all open on your exhalation. And as you inhale, imagine you're bringing this energy back into your heart. So now the lotus closes in your heart, and you're taking the energy internally, and the flower petals close up just like they would do at night when the sun goes down. So you're experiencing this circulation of life energy. So let's just do this for a little bit. Exhale, lotus in the heart opens, flowers bloom all around you, blossom. Inhale, you draw the energy back into the heart, the lotus in the heart closes, and the roses close up. And just do this for a little bit. And then just relax and open your eyes. So this probably felt quite a bit different than the practice with the compasses and the magnetism, because we're working with a different form of energy. Both subtle forms of energy, but they're, you could say, different frequencies or vibrations of energy. And so we'll do one more practice, and this one will be working with light. So it's a reality, it's measurable that we emit photons. Our body emits photons, our eyes emit photons. They don't just take in light, they actually emit photons. And there was a scientist in Japan who way back in the 70s did an experiment with experienced meditators where he had a little photoelectric cell that was turned on by light, and it was hooked up to a light bulb. And when the experienced meditators were focusing on emanating light, they could actually light up the light bulb by turning on the photoelectric cell. So that's a pretty dramatic proof that we do radiate light. Well, we don't need equipment to be able to do this. We know we see people and we say, well, this person really has a lot of light about them. And it could be the same person, but we see them another day and they're really in a bad mood, and we can tell they seem kind of dark, depressed, and we can, I mean, there's a tangible difference. And I'm sure all of us have had this experience, and the same thing with ourselves. Some days we just really feel radiant and lots of light, and other times not so much. Well, we can actually increase the light that we emanate in our being, and we're not just like a mirror. The light comes in, the light goes back out unchanged. We're actually experiencing, you could say, a circulation of light, but it's not a circulation of the unchanged light. The light is actually transformed by the uniqueness of who we are and by what we put onto that light coming back out. And that could be a thought, it could be an emotion, it could just be a state of being. So let's just try this. So close your eyes and imagine as you breathe in the reality, the fact that we're constantly drawing in the light of the stars, of distant stars that may not even exist anymore. All of those photons, I mean, we're surrounded by them. We're in an ocean of light, even though we can't see most of that light. So we're taking this light in, but also imagine another reality, even if we don't know how to perceive it yet, that we're in an ocean of subtle energy, of subtle forms of light that are of a different nature than the physical light of a light bulb or even of the sun. The mystics call this the uncreated light, or the all-pervading light. It's light that doesn't come from a point source. It's like emerges from everywhere. So imagine as you breathe in, you're just taking in this light, all these forms of light into your being. And as you exhale, open your eyes, but try not to focus on anything. Just imagine you're looking at something way off in the distance, so anything close by is going to just be blurred. You're not trying to see anything, but as you exhale, imagine that your eyes are like the headlights on a car, and they're radiating light, two beams of light out into infinity. So you inhale, and as you inhale, if you want, you can turn your eyeballs upwards and you can curl your tongue back onto your palate. This stimulates the pineal gland. You're drawing in this subtle light. And as you exhale, open your eyes and just allow these two beams of light to emanate from your eyes out into space. And then just repeat, close your eyes, curl your tongue back on your palate, turn your eyeballs upward without straining them. Draw on this subtle light and radiate it out as you open your eyes. And do this for a while. And if you like, you can imagine that this light that comes from your eyes is the color blue. Now, there's a more advanced form of this practice I'll just mention, but you can try it on your own later after you've gotten the hang of this first step. So the second step would be the same on the inhalation, but as you exhale, there's still the two beams of blue light coming from the eyes, but now there's a beam of violet light that comes from the third eye, and it's like it's going right down the center of this track of these two beams. So you have two beams of blue, and then from the third eye, there's a violet ray that comes out from the third eye. So just try this for a bit. Then just relax. So what was your experience working with this practice? Yes, Doug?
Well, I've the whole time together that we've had, I've really had a positive response. And the reason is I've been fighting off a bug all day. And one of the things that I've noticed is, and in the past, I do healing visualizations and I use light and other kinds of methods. And for today, some reason, I realized that when I get pulled away, which my mind wants to do, into disturbance, oh, my body feels crappy, I feel lethargic, I've got fever, my throat is sore, and my nose is running, and my chest is congested, and I get pulled away into that disturbance, it almost is like I lose that alignment with what I would call healing positive energy. And tonight in this time together, I realized that when I go into that alignment with what I would call universal energy, both internally and externally, we both are, that disturbance goes away and I feel better and healthier and more vibrant. And and again, it's just that idea of aligning, I think, with those subtle energies that it's so easy to forget about, or that they get clouded over by our ordinary everyday disturbances, whether it's sicknesses or somebody's a pain in the ass or whatever it might be. And so I really appreciated this evening for that reminder of how powerful it is. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone else? Practice with the light and the flowers? Lee?
Well, you know, with the light, I think I felt the same thing that Doug did, but in a different way. You know, the light that comes in and the photons and everything, and then sending out the blue light and the violet light. It was I would notice that sometimes it was like laser sharp, and then sometimes it might be diffuse or spreading out, you know, and I thought, you know, that is my disruption of just like he said, the thought of his physicality. It was like, you know, we're these light bearers, these light bringers, and how we metabolize it and send it out into the world is what we were doing there.
Yeah, and with practice, we get better at being able to focus. And you know, if you're a musician and you never practice, you're probably not going to be really good, or just any kind of skill. If you're an artist and you don't work at it, or a writer. And sometimes with spirituality, there's an assumption, well, we should just be able to get there. You know, here's a book tells you, I'll just skip to the end because I don't want to do all these boring exercises. But we need to keep ourselves in tune. The Sufis have a principle that they call attunement. I mean, it's like keeping things harmonious, not just on the physical level, but the mental level, the emotional level, but also the harmony and balance of working with subtle energies, and then eventually even learning how to fashion subtle energies and to bring them into manifesting different. I'm not talking about making something appear out of thin air, but Pure Light would talk about configuring our subtle bodies, you know, to make them even more beautiful. And so there's skills and there's so many practices that could be done. So I would encourage you, even some of the ones that I've suggested, or perhaps you have ones that you work with, but do something regularly and you will get results from it if it's something authentic. And then there's always more. I mean, the practices are really a preparation for what is revealed beyond what we could even imagine could be revealed, because if it wasn't something more than what we thought it could be, it wouldn't be so amazing. That's what makes spirituality so interesting and fulfilling. There's no end to what can be discovered. It's not like it's just all sitting there, like I used to think of what the Akashic records were, like this fixed cosmic library. We could just go and read it and we know what everything was and will be. No, it's always being, it's like the internet, it's always being updated. It's always being changed by us. So we have just a minute left. Any last thoughts? We have one more of these sessions next week at the same time. Well,
thank you, Dr. Don. One of the things I wanted to say is I really appreciate the idea of first, and what you're leading us through here is the idea of noticing these subtle energies, and then cultivating these subtle energies, and then the ability to direct these subtle energies in a way that enhances our life experience and that experience of others as well as the planet. Because so often we know that mental illness, mental disturbance is about focusing on that which does not serve life but diminishes life. So I worry about things, or I got to pay bills, or whatever it might be, which takes me away. And it's almost by default that and there is a default mode network of the brain. By default, I'm moving into this negative arena, and that it really does require that I and whomever else is choosing to do so to intentionally learn to notice, cultivate, and direct these subtle energies in a positive way. So I'm guessing that you would be open to people contacting you, or because I'm imagining this kind of stuff is in your books, and maybe people are opening to contacting you directly about maybe courses or other things you have to offer. So maybe sharing your email or someplace people could contact you.
Yeah, I mean, I would be glad to hear from anybody that's watching this with questions or comments or feedback. My best email is drdonw@aol.com, drdonw@aol.com, no periods or anything. And I check my email often, so I will respond if you send me an email. So I would welcome hearing from not just those of you who are participating live in this, but those of you who may be watching it at some future time. So we will tune in again next week.
Yes, next week. Thanks again, Dr. Don. And I just wanted to put in a quick note that the new fall UU Mystics in Community newsletter is on our Facebook page, UU Mystics, and you can join uumystics.org by going to the website and just signing in, and have access to conversations, and also to log into these videos and comment on the blog. So again, I can't say enough of how wonderful this is, and I just look forward to next week and learning more. Yes. So
All right.
may all journey well.
Good night, everyone.